There is a country on the Red Sea that most of the world has never seen. Not because it is hidden behind mountains or buried beneath jungle, but because its own government has spent more than 3 decades keeping the cameras out. Journalists are rarely let in. Tourists trickle through a handful at a time, on visas that take weeks to arrange. And yet, behind that silence, nearly 4 million people wake up every morning, brew coffee over hot coals, walk to work past crumbling Art Deco cinemas, and build ordinary lives in one of the most extraordinary and least understood places on the planet. This is Eritrea, a nation forged in a 30-year war, wrapped in Italian elegance, bound together by a fierce, almost stubborn belief in doing things for themselves. Some call it Africa's most secretive nation. The people who live there might simply call it home. Before we go further, if this kind of deep, honest journey into the world's least visited places is something you enjoy, consider subscribing, because there are many more countries like this one waiting to be explored. And I'd love to know in the comments below where in the world you're watching from tonight. Eritrea sits in the Horn of Africa, wedged between Sudan, Ethiopia, and Djibouti, with more than 2,000 kilometers of coastline curling along the western edge of the Red Sea. It is a small country by African standards, smaller than the state of Ohio. Yet it holds an almost improbable range of landscapes inside its borders. In the center rises a highland plateau, the northern extension of the Ethiopian highlands, where the capital, Asmara, sits at an elevation that keeps its air cool and thin even as the country around it bakes. Drop down from that plateau toward the coast, and the temperature climbs with every mile. Massawa, the ancient port city on the Red Sea, can average temperatures near 30 degrees Celsius, while Asmara, less than 70 kilometers away as the crow flies, sits comfortably in the high teens. It is one country holding 2 climates, connected by a single winding road that drops nearly 2.5 kilometers in elevation over a short dramatic descent. To the west, the land flattens into the plains of the Gash-Barka region, Eritrea's agricultural heartland, where sorghum and other grains are grown wherever the rains allow. To the north, in the Anseba region around the city of Keren, the terrain climbs again into hills scattered with fig and eucalyptus trees, watered by 2 separate rainy seasons each year. To the south, near the historic provinces that now form the southern region, the land rises to its highest point, a peak just over 3,000 meters that looks down over a mosaic of terraced hillsides and small farming villages. And out in the Red Sea itself lies the Dahlak archipelago, a scatter of more than 300 islands, many of them uninhabited, ringed by coral reefs that have barely been touched by modern tourism. Few countries pack this much geographic contrast into so small a footprint. Fewer still remain this unexplored. The climate follows the terrain. On the coast, conditions are hot and arid nearly all year, with rainfall so rare that the plains south of Massawa rank among the driest and hottest stretches of the entire African continent. On the highland plateau, the picture changes entirely. Rain falls in 2 distinct seasons, feeding terraced fields that have been farmed the same way for generations, and nights can turn genuinely cold, sometimes brushing freezing temperatures in the depths of winter. It means a single journey across Eritrea can feel like crossing 3 or 4 different countries, all without a single border crossing. The administrative map reflects this diversity too. Eritrea is divided into 6 regions, each built around its own landscape and its own character. The central region surrounds Asmara itself, cool and compact. Anseba, to the north, is centered on the historic hill town of Keren, once a British administrative post where a large open-air livestock market still draws traders from across the region every week: camels, goats, and cattle changing hands under the shade of towering baobab trees that give the town its distinctive silhouette. The southern region, built from the old provinces of Saraye and Akele Guzai, holds the country's highest ground, terraced and green in the rainy months. Gashbarka, sprawling across the west, is Eritrea's breadbasket and its most sparsely populated stretch. And along the coast, the northern and southern Red Sea regions could not be more different from the cool plateau above them. Dry, sun-scorched, and tied economically to the sea rather than the soil. It is genuinely rare to find a country this compact holding 6 regions with so little in common climatically and yet functioning, geographically, as a single connected whole. What ties this varied landscape together is the light. Eritreans who have lived abroad often speak of the particular quality of highland light in Asmara, thin, gold, and impossibly clear, falling across rows of palm trees and pastel-colored buildings in the late afternoon. On the coast, that same light turns the Red Sea into sheets of hammered silver at sunrise, and the ruins of old Ottoman and Italian buildings in Massawa glow amber by evening. Massawa itself carries centuries of layered history in its coral stone walls. Having served as a key Red Sea trading post under Ottoman rule from the 16th century onward, long before Italian colonizers arrived and left their own imprint on its harbor. Out past the port, the Dalak archipelago stretches into the sea, its coral reefs still largely undived, its beaches still largely unwalked, simply because so few visitors have ever had the chance to reach them. It is a country that rewards patience and close attention, in a world of most travelers who have simply never been given the chance to look. Step into an Eritrean home, in Asmara or in a village in the highlands, and the day tends to begin the same way it has for generations, with coffee. Not a quick cup on the way out the door, but a ceremony. Unhurried and deliberate. Green coffee beans are roasted over hot coals in a shallow pan, the smoke drifting through the room, and the roaster wafts the fragrant smoke toward guests as a welcome before grinding the beans by hand and brewing them in a clay pot called a jabena. The coffee is poured in 3 rounds, each one a little weaker than the last, and each round carries its own name and its own small significance. Traditionally called Awel, Kalei, and Bereka in Tigrinya. Skipping out early before the 3rd and final round is considered a quiet social misstep, a sign of a guest not fully settling in. Neighbors gather. Popcorn is often served alongside. Conversation stretches out over the better part of an hour, sometimes longer. In a country where daily life can be materially difficult, the coffee ceremony remains an anchor, a ritual of hospitality that costs little and means a great deal. Food in Eritrea tells its own layered story. The staple of most meals is injera, a spongy, slightly sour flatbread made from teff, torn by hand and used to scoop up whatever sits alongside it. Zigni, a spiced meat stew built on berbere chili paste, is a favorite for special occasions, while shiro, a smooth stew made from ground chickpeas or lentils, appears constantly during periods of religious fasting, since roughly half the population observes the fasting calendar of the Eritrean Orthodox Church. Along the coast, seafood pulled straight from the Red Sea, grouper, snapper, lobster, finds its way onto plates in ways rarely seen further inland, often grilled simply and served with little more than lemon and bread. And then there is the unmistakable Italian layer, a legacy of nearly 50 years of colonial rule that never fully faded. Pasta and pizza are everyday foods in Asmara, sold from small trattorias alongside injera houses. A perfectly pulled macchiato, made the Italian way, is treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for a fine wine, and gelato shops do steady business on warm afternoons. It is not unusual to eat a plate of shiro for lunch and a bowl of pasta for dinner in the very same household without anyone finding that strange at all. Homes vary enormously depending on where in the country you land. In Asmara, many families live in colonial-era apartment buildings. Their facades a faded wash of pastel pink, yellow, and blue, with high ceilings and shuttered windows built for a cooler climate. Housing in the capital is genuinely tight. New construction has been limited for years, and finding a modern one-bedroom apartment in the city center typically means paying somewhere in the range of $200 to $400 a month, a serious sum in an economy where many salaries fall well below that. Outside the capital, in villages across the highlands and lowlands, homes are often built from stone, mud brick, or timber, arranged around a central courtyard where daily life, cooking, chatting, minding children, unfolds largely outdoors. The rhythm of the day tends to move at a different pace than in most of the world's larger cities. Markets open early, before the heat sets in on the coast or before the highland chill lifts in Asmara. In the capital's central market and in the sprawling Medibur district, vendors lay out produce, spices, second-hand clothing, and hand-forged tools. And bargaining is treated less as a transaction and more as a small daily conversation. Children walk to school in uniform, often in groups, since education through the early grades is delivered in local languages before shifting toward Arabic and English in the higher years. Extended family still shapes daily life in a way that has faded in many parts of the world. Grandparents, parents, and children frequently share a household or live within easy walking distance of one another. And major life events, weddings, religious holidays, the birth of a child, are treated as occasions for the whole neighborhood rather than just the immediate family. Religious holidays punctuate the calendar for both major faiths side by side: Eritrean Orthodox Christmas in January, Easter in the spring, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha for the Muslim community, and it is common in mixed neighborhoods for Christian and Muslim families to exchange visits and small gifts around one another's holidays, a habit of mutual respect that traces back to the same wartime unity that shaped the country's politics. Streets in the capital fill in the evening with a very particular ritual borrowed from the Italian era and never abandoned: the passeggiata, an unhurried evening stroll along the capital's main avenue, where older residents in tailored suits and polished shoes walk arm in arm with friends, stopping at cafes for another macchiato, greeting neighbors, watching the world go by. It is a slower, more communal version of city life than most visitors expect from an African capital. Shaped by decades of relative physical isolation and by a culture that has always placed enormous value on gathering, sharing food, and simply being present with one another. If there is one word that captures how Eritreans describe themselves, it is self-reliance. It shows up constantly, in conversation, in government slogans, in the way people talk about their own history. It traces directly back to the 30-year War of Independence from Ethiopia, a conflict so long that it shaped nearly 2 full generations, fought largely without significant outside support, using resources scavenged, rebuilt, and repurposed by the fighters themselves. Wartime accounts describe field hospitals dug into hillsides and schools operating out of caves, all running on almost nothing but sheer improvisation. That instinct never really left. Walk through Asmara's Medibur market today and you will find an entire district built around recycling, craftsmen turning old oil drums into cooking stoves, scrap metal into tools, spare parts into something usable again. It is not a nostalgic performance for outsiders. It is simply how things have been done here for decades, a practical philosophy born of necessity that Eritreans still take real pride in. Government messaging leans on this same idea heavily, holding up self-reliance almost as a civic virtue, a lesson repeated at school assemblies, national holidays, and public murals. Detached from politics, though, the underlying instinct is genuinely woven into how ordinary Eritreans see themselves: resourceful, patient, unwilling to be defined by what they lack. That same wartime unity shaped how the country thinks about itself as a nation. Eritrea is home to 9 officially recognized ethnic groups, the largest being the Tigrinya, concentrated in the highlands and forming roughly half the population, followed by the Tigray, who are more numerous in the lowlands. Add to that a near-even split between Christianity and Islam nationwide, with the Eritrean Orthodox Church strongest in the highlands and Sunni Islam predominant along the coast, and you have a country that, on paper, could easily have fractured along ethnic or religious lines. Instead, the shared experience of the independence struggle became the glue. To this day, one of the most common phrases you will hear at national celebrations is Awet N'Hafash, victory to the masses, a wartime rallying cry that has outlived the war itself and become something closer to a national motto. That diversity extends further than most outsiders realize. Beyond the Tigrinya and Tigray, Eritrea's 9 recognized ethnic groups include the Saho and Afar of the eastern lowlands, traditionally tied to herding and along the coast to trade across the Red Sea, the Bilan, centered around Karen, who blend Christian and Muslim traditions within the same community. The Kunama and Nara of the southwest, among the country's oldest documented inhabitants, the Beja in the north, and the Rashaida, a smaller historically nomadic Arabic-speaking group known for distinctive dress and jewelry passed down through generations. Music and dance still carry the imprint of this variety, from the driving rhythms of Highland Tigrinya wedding songs to Saho and Afar melodies shaped by centuries of coastal trade, and traditional dress, still worn at festivals and religious holidays, differs sharply from one community to the next, even within a single small country. Language mirrors this same layered identity. There is no single official language written into the constitution. Instead, Tigrinya, Arabic, and English all function as working languages, alongside smaller languages like Tigray, Saho, Afar, Bilan, Kunama, and Nara, each tied to its own community. Walk through Asmara and you might hear all of them within a single city block, sometimes within a single conversation. Add to that the lingering imprint of Italian, still used by older generations and still visible on shopfronts and menus, and the result is a country that speaks in layers, each one a record of who has passed through and who has stayed. And Asmara itself is perhaps Eritrea's greatest cultural artifact. When Italy colonized Eritrea in the late 19th century and held it until the Second World War, Italian architects treated the capital as something close to a laboratory, filling it with nearly 400 Art Deco, Futurist, and Modernist buildings in barely 2 decades. The Fiat Tagliero service station, its concrete wings sweeping outward as though the building itself were preparing for takeoff, is the most photographed example. Designed by the Italian architect Giuseppe Petazzi in 1938 and inspired directly by aviation. But it is only one piece of a much larger picture. Because Eritrea's isolation kept large-scale redevelopment at bay for so long, this collection of buildings survived almost entirely intact, unlike comparable colonial-era quarters in many other African capitals that were demolished or built over during decades of rapid urban growth, earning Asmara UNESCO World Heritage status as one of the best-preserved modernist cities anywhere on Earth. Locals sometimes call it La Piccola Roma, Little Rome, a nickname coined generations ago that has simply never gone away. If you have made it this far into the video, thank you for sticking with us. If a documentary like this is the kind of thing you want more of, this is exactly the moment to hit that subscribe button. Because we are about to move into the part of Eritrea's story that most travel content skips entirely. No honest look at life in Eritrea can avoid its central defining reality: national service. When Eritrea won its independence in 1993, the law required 18 months of service, a standard arrangement not unlike military or civil service requirements in many countries around the world. But after a brutal 2-year border war with Ethiopia broke out in 1998, the government declared a state of emergency and simply stopped releasing conscripts. That state of emergency has never formally ended. Today, national service in Eritrea can stretch not for months but for years, in many documented cases for well over a decade, sometimes longer, with no fixed release date given to those serving. Conscripts, who can include both men and women, are typically pulled into military training during their final year of secondary school, often completed at the Sawa military camp in the country's west, and can be assigned to military duty, construction projects, farming, or government administration, all for wages that human rights organizations and the United Nations describe as extremely low, far below what would be needed to support a family. There is no legal allowance for conscientious objection, and no fixed exit point built into the system for those who serve. International human rights bodies, including the United Nations, have documented harsh conditions within this system, and families of those who attempt to leave the country without permission have themselves faced consequences from the state. It is, by a wide margin, the single most defining and most difficult fact of ordinary Eritrean life. And it is the primary reason so many young Eritreans have chosen, over the years, to leave the country rather than remain within it. That system sits inside a broader political structure that is unusually closed even by regional standards. Eritrea has held no national elections since independence. A single party, formed from the Wartime Liberation Front, is the only one legally permitted to exist. And the same president has led the country since 1993. The Constitution, ratified in 1997, has never actually been put into force. Press freedom is essentially non-existent. Independent newspapers were shut down in the early 2000s. And for years, international watchdogs monitoring media freedom have placed Eritrea at or near the very bottom of their global rankings. Some journalists detained in that crackdown, including the well-known case of Dawit Isaak, a Swedish Eritrean writer and co-founder of an independent newspaper, have been held without trial for more than 2 decades, their whereabouts still not publicly confirmed. This is the machinery behind the country's reputation as Africa's most secretive nation. And it is worth being clear-eyed about. The isolation that gives Asmara its beautifully frozen-in-time architecture and its quiet, unhurried streets is the same isolation born from a government that tightly restricts information, movement, and dissent. Economically, the picture is equally sobering. Eritrea's economy remains small and tightly state-controlled, with most large enterprises owned or directed by the government, and its currency, the nakfa, is officially pegged to the US dollar but trades very differently on informal markets, creating real gaps between official prices and lived reality. Average monthly wages for many ordinary jobs fall somewhere in the range of $100 to $300, while rent imported goods. And fuel can eat up a significant share of that income, particularly in Asmara. The country's most promising economic prospects now lie in mining, gold, zinc, copper, and a large potash deposit that international partners have been developing, which has helped keep modest economic growth alive in recent years. But a shortage of skilled labor, unreliable electricity, and a business environment ranked among the most difficult in the world for entrepreneurs continue to hold private enterprise back. Even something as basic as knowing exactly how many people live in Eritrea is complicated. The country has not conducted a full census in decades, and population estimates from different international organizations vary by millions of people. A small but telling detail about just how little verified information makes it out of the country at all. The consequence of all this has been one of the most sustained waves of emigration anywhere in the world relative to a country's size. Over the past 2 decades, hundreds of thousands of Eritreans, a substantial share of them young people avoiding indefinite conscription, have left the country, many crossing into neighboring Ethiopia or Sudan first, some continuing on toward Europe along routes that have proven dangerous and, for many, fatal, those who are caught trying to leave, or who are forcibly returned after failed asylum claims abroad, have in documented cases faced detention and renewed conscription upon return. The result is a country whose population skews young at home, with a median age under 20, even as an entire generation of its adults' lives scattered across refugee communities, diaspora neighborhoods, and resettlement programs on nearly every continent. Ask almost any Eritrean family, whether still in the country or long since abroad, and there is a strong chance someone in it has made that journey, or is still weighing whether to. None of this means daily commerce simply stops. It means it operates under real constraints. Government price controls keep some essentials artificially stable, but also produce shortages of imported goods when supply chains tighten. Electricity outages remain a persistent frustration in Asmara and beyond, a factor businesses and economists both point to as a drag on growth. And because so much of the formal economy runs through state-owned enterprises, opportunities for private business, for the kind of small entrepreneurship that drives economic mobility elsewhere in Africa, remain narrow, which is part of why the country has so consistently ranked among the most difficult places in the world to start or grow a business. And yet, inside all of this, life continues, not in spite of hardship exactly, but woven through it. The way it does everywhere people build families, drink coffee with neighbors, and try to give their children something better. The honest picture of Eritrea holds both things at once: a genuinely warm, resilient, hospitable culture, and a genuinely repressive political system that has driven a significant share of its own population, especially its young people, to leave. Neither fact cancels the other out. Both are true, and any documentary that shows you only one side is not showing you Eritrea at all. So, could you actually live there? For the vast majority of people watching this, the honest answer is complicated. Tourism exists in a limited, tightly managed way, mostly through guided trips that require advance visas and travel permits, and those who make the journey consistently describe a country that feels almost suspended in time: safe streets, extraordinary architecture, warm and curious locals, some of the best coffee they have ever tasted. But actually living there as an outsider, building a life, working, settling in for years, is a different question entirely. Bound up with a closed economy, restricted freedoms, and a political system that offers very little room for anyone, local or foreign, to simply live as they choose. For the millions of Eritreans themselves, the choice is rarely so simple. It is not a decision between 2 travel brochures. It is family, language, memory, land their grandparents fought 30 years to defend, weighed against a system that asks enormous, often indefinite sacrifice in return. Maybe that is the real story hiding underneath the postcard image of pastel Art Deco buildings and steaming cups of Buna. Eritrea is not secretive because there is nothing there worth seeing. It is secretive because the world has rarely been allowed to see it clearly. The astonishing architecture and the coffee ceremonies alongside the conscription camps and the closed borders. All at once. All true. A nation built by people who pride themselves on doing things for themselves, still working out, decades after independence, what self-reliance should mean once the fighting is over. There is something worth sitting with in that tension. Most of the countries we think of as beautiful, remote, and untouched earned that description through geography alone. Distance, mountains, ocean. Eritrea earned it partly through geography and partly through policy, through decades of a government keeping its own story tightly controlled. That makes it a harder place to romanticize than a quiet island or a hidden valley. It also makes it, in its own way, a more honest lesson in what it actually means for a place to be unseen. Behind every strand of barbed wire and every unanswered visa application is also a grandmother roasting coffee beans over hot coals for the third round of the day. A group of teenagers arguing good-naturedly over football outside a pastel-colored cafe. A family gathering for injera and shiro on a Sunday afternoon exactly as their parents and grandparents once did. The secrecy is real. So is the ordinary, resilient, deeply human life carrying on inside it. If this journey into one of the world's least seen countries gave you something to think about, that is exactly why documentaries like this one exist, to take you somewhere the algorithm usually skips right past. If you want to keep traveling to the places most channels won't go, subscribe and join us for the next one. And before you leave, tell us in the comments, after everything you just learned, would Eritrea be a place you would want to see for yourself?